water and land, fresh or saltwater, desert or bog, and also, of course, air and sky. How easily we can slip into referring to and feeling as if these material spaces were actual divisions of existence that touch, that press, and that undulate against one another, as if there were material spaces in which, on which, and through which forms of life travel at their peril. The surface of the water to the depth of the land, the surface of land touching the expanse of the sky, the surface of air touching the void of space. All might seem to be different forms of a non-living medium that various forms of life can or cannot traverse without specific technical means of maintaining their form against an encroaching tide. The technical means may be foot, may be wing, gill, motor, wing, air tank. Many narratives recently touch on waterways, and more specifically, land on and sink within the surface of the vast oceans and seas. On the one hand are the initially state-backed climate sciences, tracking with ever more powerful instruments the changing patterns of tides, composition of aquatic creatures, and the formation of winds and changing weather patterns. For them, these sciences of climate change, the separations between wind and air and fresh and salt water, desert, bog, water, land, are initially, for them, these separations recede into the whole Earth. From the perspective of this Earth, or what many people call Gaia, all waters, lands, airs, bio and geomass co-fashion each other. They keep in place or disturb the patterns of life and non-life together. On the other hand, science and technology studies, queer science and feminist critique, and race and indigenous critique, new materialisms and ecosophies have shattered the boundaries and borders that Western epistemologies have placed on matter and which have governed all matters since. As Elizabeth Dowfrey points out, it is exactly this dual entwinement that is of the state and state power and state hegemony and critique that has given us contemporary oceanic studies. She argues that, quote, the oceanic turn of the 20th century issued from geopolitics as well as new interdisciplinary groupings in the humanities and social sciences. On the one hand, she would date the 1945 Truman Proclamation, which expanded U.S. hegemony over ocean waters and which inspired new extensions of U.S. sciences, including the development of the information sciences. On the other hand, was a spatial term in critical race and Marxist theory. And again, this is Elizabeth, quote, this loosening of nationally bounded modes of thinking about capital and space led to an unprecedented number of transoceanic studies, notably the work of Marcus Rediker, which helped to inspire Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, a text that inaugurated a new generation of thinking about race in transoceanic ways, unquote. As she notes, quote, no longer relegated to aqua nullius, the ocean is now understood in terms of its agency, its anthropogenic pollution and acidity, and its interspecies ontologies, all of which suggest that climate change is shaping new oceanic imaginaries, unquote. Tonight, I want to talk about another set of conditions that allow us to think oceans as becomings with land, becomings with air, becomings with salt and fresh, becomings with different kinds of aquatic creatures, becoming as islands sink and in tidal zones rise. Now, obviously, becomings with is Donna Haraway's phrasing, but the turn to, in now a metaphorical sense, oceanic submersions is just part, or just participates in four broad axioms of existence that have emerged, at least since what Malcolm X called the great tidal wave of color in the 1950s, and that now shape the common sense of many people in this room. The four axioms are, number one, and I don't know why I didn't put them up here. You just gotta remember. Number one, the ecstasy of existence. And I'm gonna come back to these, so don't worry. The ecstasy of existence, the distribution of the effects of power and the power to affect a given terrain of existence, the multiplicity and collapse of forms of the event, and the collapse of Western disciplines of embodied distinction and hierarchy. Those are the four. The status of these axioms varies, as we would expect, across specific disciplines and intellectual projects. Some scholars approach these axioms as if they were true, in the sense that they provide a better fit for how reality actually works than older ones, older Western epistemologies, which viewed the world as consisting of discrete subjects and objects acting in cause-effect relations with each other. Some scholars might go further, some have, and argue that these axioms, that at least the axioms in here already, 1 through 3, and I'm just going to keep repeating them, that is, the ecstasy of existence, the distribution of effects of power, the power to effect, and the multiplicity and collapse of forms of the event. Might go further and argue that axioms 1 through 3 capture how existence works in relation to itself. I myself don't care, or in a more scholarly phrasing, I am not interested so much in whether these axioms capture what is, but rather if this is what we think is true-ish, then how would our political concepts, our actions, and our way of narrating the emergence of these axioms need to change? In other words, if these axioms constitute, to a greater or lesser degree, the presuppositional background of current theoretical and political discourse, how are, or should, we tell the story of solidarity, concept formation, and action? Thus, all I want to do this evening is first walk through these axioms one by one, and then we'll find out walking backwards again through them. So I'm going to go one way, and then we're going to see we have to go the other way. Suggest what is at stake if we read the history of waterways, oceans, seas, but also what they touch and form and co-substantiate, land and air, through these contemporary axioms, and read these axioms themselves from the direction of the Martinique poet and theorist Edouard Lusson, namely from the direction of the history of the Middle Passage. I'm just going to leave that there. I always think I have a lot more time than I do. I don't know why. Because I start out going really slow and everything, and then I'll speed up, or I don't know. But anyways, I'm just going to start. Let's go with this framing our movement, providing direction across the seas. The first axiom, the ecstasy of existence. Like all the subsequent axioms we're going to discuss, the first axiom is not an interdisciplinary protocol that scholars sign on to as if delegates to a climate conference. Rather, they are shared spaces of intellectual maneuver and dispute. They're where we come to find out we are and are arguing about in. Not surprisingly, then, the exact vocabulary, meaning, and dynamics of the ecstasy of existence depend on whom you're reading at the time, or who you like, or who's sexy to you. In her 2007 book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, Karen Broad, for instance, argues that, quote, to be entangled is not simply to be entwined with another, as in the joining of separate entities, but to lack an independent, self-contained existence, unquote. Jane Bennett turns to the term assemblage to note that agencies to note the agencies that emerge when scholars begin, quote, thinking about the life-matter binary, and instead focusing on the collaboration, cooperation, and interactive interference of many bodies and forces, unquote. Donna Haraway prefers the term symbiogenesis because it stresses, quote, the ordinary is a multi-partner mud dance issuing from and in entangled species. Indeed, it's Haraway, we have to note, who has thought longest and hardest and with a capacious creativity about the making and importance of the troubling nature of what she calls oddkin for an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and post-human feminism within the Western Academy. So if we're in the Western Academy, and we're talking about the Western Academy. Across these varying scholarly projects is an insistence that neither objects nor subjects are discrete things tied together, but rather that both the tying and the thing are illusions created by dense regions of intersecting and materializing forces. The illusion of the boundary provides, and against which, and within which, a subject or object can be defined or is defined, can be stabilized or is stabilized, can be characterized or is characterized, and can be made into something like an autonomous entity. This doesn't mean that all Western epistemologies claim to be able to know that all of them are moving in this direction. Take, for instance, Graham Harman, who argues all objects are objects in a robust sense, that is, every object, and there are only objects, is an independent and autonomous entity with its own unique and independent essence. Now, for him, of course, all objects, including human subjects, distort their essence in relation to other objects and themselves by necessity. As a result, objects withdraw from other objects, even though through some magical quality are able to seduce other objects. For I still haven't figured out why objects are just always, I don't know. Anyways, expressing their inner but elusive qualities aesthetically. Anyways, sorry, that was a diversion. The point is that this illusion of the boundary has been foundational for the Western natural sciences, and I would, in geontologies, I try and show also the scar homology between those natural sciences and the critical sciences in the sense of knowing. This illusion has been a foundation for the biological sciences, at least, relying as they have on the concept of a membrane to animate the difference between life and non-life, and to animate the difference between forms of life. This next slide. Oh yeah, this is the gross slide. Okay. The smallest unit of life, the cell, is defined and made possible by its membrane. The human by its skin. The species by its reproductive limits. But this boundary illusion also provides the conditions for thinking about and being able to talk about, theorize, final causes, teleology, finitude, and eventfulness, from Aristotle's acorn to Hegel's Geist to Huffington's Clash of Civilizations. Bang, you need them. But the illusion of the border, and this is important, has a material reference, that it's not all just smoothy smooth. The phantasmagoria has a phenomenological skid mark. No, we have to take this seriously. If we're taking, no, we do have to take it seriously. If we are not to take seriously this phenomenal referent of this illusion, we have to take. If we don't take it seriously, then either we end up with a smooth thing, that is, no difference in space, and if we over-encrust it, let's see if I can do this again, sometimes it will do it, we end up with that Western philosophy and epistemology of enclosed. We have to do something, or take seriously perhaps, something that Gregory Bateson argued in Mind and Nature. In Mind and Nature, he writes, quote, "Inside and outside are not appropriate metaphors for inclusion and exclusion in speaking of the self, or mind, or life. For him, mind is a mode of process and classification that turns back on itself when it hits information, or difference, re-sacking itself and to other sacks. The condition of the self is thus a process. For Bateson, mind is a verb of classification. It is a response to difference that makes a difference for the information of mind, biology, soul, life. In other words, mind is not in the sack any more than that junk is in that cell, any more than the subject is in her skin or the object ends at its crust. For him, at least, the mind, life, etc., is imminent to the sacking itself, or as I've put elsewhere, to its embagonation. I'm taking that bagging it. I know, that's one of my favorites. This sacking is always, of course, inside and outside itself, sacking and bagonating and banking. When we look at what appear to be objects, that is something like, now look at those little things spurting out there. We now see the dense material ridges that forces create by disturbing or keeping other places as ridges. Embankments then include the sandbags or the sand dunes that keep a flood at bay as long as they can keep themselves in place as they are assaulted by the pounding and creeping waves of climate change. Embankments are mountains that contain the circulation of wind and trap pollutants until they themselves crumble under that strain. Embankments are the social identities that provide the conduits through which rights are circulated until they are twisted by these circulating rights or twisted away from them and become new forms of identity. And it is the skin that protects the inner organs unless an inner cancer eats it away, having come or begun from the outside through contamination or mutation. All these sackings of material space create the contours that are misinterpreted as autonomous insides and outsides. And this méconnaissance provides a ground for Western disciplines to differentiate themselves, biology, geology, etc., and from this initial differentiation, biology, geology, to create endless second and third and fourth order interpretations of reality. Thus, the biological difference between organic skin and rock surfaces rests on differentiating the internal potential of self-repair in the former from the lack of this potential in the latter. And this difference ramifies into subsequent ones, like the legalities of the difference between murder, possible with human subjects, killing with animal life, and destruction with inorganic objects. Without these insides or outsides, murder, killing, and destruction weave in and out of each other. And without these borders, the desecration of indigenous landscapes in Australia that wouldn't be called desecration, they would be called murder. So if a mining company wrecks what's called a sacred site, it wouldn't be a legal instance of desecration, it would be a legal instance of murder. If a rock is qua rock, though, or soil qua soil, then from its point of view, or many humans who do not stay within these divisions, humans are merely a moment on the, quote, journey and travels of minerals, as one of my students put it. In producing us, it maintains itself. In other words, the assertion that the self-repair of life has a different status to the inert passivity of non-life allows the latter, non-life, to be treated very differently than the former, and also allows late liberalism to treat those who consider this difference not to be a difference that matters, to also be treated differently. So any group that says the difference between life and non-life is irrelevant to my relationship to country can be treated under these conditions. But rocks use gravity to make sacks themselves, or gravity sacks rocks. The more, the denser the gravity is right now, I think, constant. To unsack these various formations of rocks require other sacked materials, whether the chemicals that frack shale or diamonds that tip drills for diamond drilling. That is, every tactic of self-repair, of being shattered or reinforced, leaves and absorbs tailings and trailings that circulate back into the movement and embankment of other tailings. When object and subject are reconceptualized in this first extimate existence, entangled existence, when they're reconceptualized as areas of ongoing embankment, sacking, disembanking, embagonation, disembagonation, 2 points emerge, the first of which is that because all embankments or skinning or sackings are temporary scaffoldings that are in need of constant reinforcement and repair, they must always reach into and disturb or keep in place other regions. Or they have to find a means of limiting other regions from reaching in to them and disturbing them. To crib Michel Serres' concept of the parasite, all embankments are in an abuse relationship that is inescapable from all forms of exchange. The abuse can be a source of power. The abuse can be a source of power for an otherwise, like if you're otherwise to the system, you reach in and you try and unsack it to give yourself some embankment. It can be, obviously, the means for a hegemonic formation to stay in place. How the strainings between these spaces resolve themselves depends on how durable the materials that they are composed of are and the materials that touch them are. And here it's important to understand power as effortability and durability, the power to endure. Now this brings us to the second point about extimate existence, namely that the movement of embankments constantly lay down trails and give off tailings. Okay. When objects and subjects are reconceptualized as areas of ongoing embankment, sacking, and embagonation, the tails and trailings. They need constant reinforcement and repair. Where is this? Tailings are usually defined as a residue of whatever valuable material has been extracted from a mine. That's the literal. But as Catherine Youssef notes, such tailings and trailings are the irreducible, quote, substrata of the technosphere, once imagined and imaged as extraneous and external to the rational projects of materializing modernity, but no more. Tailings may be the physics of all embankments when viewed from their indefinable, crumbling, and corroding edges, where they become quasi-things, where dead things on live things enter nostrils and topsoil. But tailings become political when they are the material trails that someone like Katerina Teawa follows as Bonobo Island in the Pacific is gutted for the mineral phosphorus, which is crucial to the manufacturing of the fertilizer that powers the so-called green revolution. We can follow these trails as mining spews dust into the atmosphere and as winds spread the particles like settler colonizers, as airplanes spread phosphorus across previously infertile fields. As the island, Bonobo, is dispersed around the world in the form of tiny motes and big chunks of phosphorus, as it is combined and recombined with other substances, the island itself is made uninhabitable for the original residents, who in place start traveling too. But the dissipation of the island in the form of agricultural fertilizer entering the soil, plants, and human and non-human bodies, and in the form of tailings of dust entering the atmosphere, is mirrored, we could argue, by the extension of the island's sovereignty in the form of its ever vaster set of lands and landscapes, everything that all of that phosphorus went into. So that if you are from that island, you could claim anywhere that your island has extended. But equally and unavoidably, this form of chemo-sovereignty nurtures new, usually unwanted modes of existence, such as those found in and across Polynesia after the French nuclear tests, and throughout Australia in vast mining districts. All of these infrastructural histories are part of the new museums of humanity. Again, as Yusuf says, waste sites, mining shafts, and extraction zones are imagined as the new museums of humanity alongside the more effectual and accumulative material registers of pollution, toxicity, and climate change. Now these embankments, and I've been talking only about embankment and tailings, like every time you embank, it's got to be kept in place. How to keep it in place? Well, you got to take somewhere else, you will reach in, or as you reach in, it puts dust in the air, changes biochemically things around it. And I'm talking about mainly about things that you would see maybe as material, rather than maybe, or opposed to maybe, mental processes. But long before Bateson came up with his biosphere theory of mind, William James proposed that mental concepts, and indeed all mental life, were efforts of embankment. Mental life is, and thus all concepts are, for him, or were, for him, a cacophony of, quote, efforts of attention. The source of concepts would never, therefore, be found by burrowing deeper into the mind, the abstracted mind, in search of ever more abstracted forms. Instead, if we understand concepts as forms of effort, that concepts as itself these embanked areas, James argues that we must, if we're going to see it this way, we must place mental life in the social worlds in which it exists, in which it is given dimension and qualities, and which it spreads. Concepts are not merely situated in the social world, in other words, they are the social world. They are the social world. And this is not the social world of meaning, but the social world of distributed energies and abilities to focus on the tasks at hand. That means, and it was for James, that means those whose lives are constantly shattered, disembanked, that late liberalism makes shudder constantly through class and race and settler colonialism. Part of the consequences for James is that the ability to form the concepts we need to analyze settler colonialism, capitalism, racism, which have to come from the world in which the effects of that are happening, often don't have the energy to do so. Thus, for James, we have to pay attention to the actual world in its multiplicity. We have to pay attention to the potential explanatory concepts that might provide us an account of the world in the place in which the world is most fracked and shattered. And it demands we pay attention to where these constitutive figurations are able to emerge, from who and why, and whether or not they're able to endure as much as sandbags against tides. Now, at this point, we've slid fully into the second axiom. That is, if we argue that existence is entangled, then the second axiom, the distribution of the effects of power, the power to affect a given terrain of existence, I'm already talking about that, and I have been for a long time. Indeed, the political potential of the first axiom in the current crisis of global climate change and toxicity depends on the second axiom's ability to dislodge any false logical semantic equivalence arising from the first. While in general, each and every, sacking, bagination, and kind of making a space in which certain kinds of processes can happen, health, pure water, mental life. While in general, each and every one of these ways of forming space, of ridging it, providing skins, creates an inside by pulling from and leaking into an outside, and vice versa. not every one of these processes is afforded the same amount of force to reach out and disturb other regions, or to keep at bay those trying to reach in and disturb them. In other words, what appears to be an equivalence at a semantic level, all embankments do X, Y, and Z, existence is entangled, is absolutely not equivalent from a material perspective. And this is part of what I think we really need to start focusing on. It's like the sudden shifts in when we shift from description, theoretical, and then we move that theoretical into material. Because really, we'll see at the end, it's going the other way around. The confrontation between Standing Rock Sioux trying to protect the current embankment of water and the police equipped with more than $60,000 worth of body armor, tactical equipment, and crowd control devices is not played out with equivalent forces or powers. And residents of Flint, Michigan do not have the power to roll into, oh, what's that? Sorry. I don't know what that was. Those were tailings. I know that helped you. And I'm really trying to get us to see this entangled existence, but entangled, differentially protected. The residents of Flint, Michigan do not have the power to roll into the suburbs of Detroit and reroute their clean water supply, which would be one way of solving the problem. It's only when we pull the abstractions of Axiom 1, entangled existence, into the differential dynamics of Axiom 2 that the full implications of the politics of this first axiom come into view. It's only when we do this. And it's only with the second axiom that we can move our focus on specific political modes of materialization without creating ethical and social hierarchies of existence among subjects and objects of existence. So, and in the previous, there's that when the Standing Rock Sioux are standing there, all of what they have, including ridges, waterways, signs, clothing, horses, protests, other bodies that they mobilized against a police force with, heavily armed tanks, battering rams, whatever that kind of armor is they have. All of that is the condition of whether and who is going to be embanked and disembanked. And thus, we don't really have to pull up a hierarchy between life and non-life, forms of life, etc. Now, the third axiom, the multiplicity and collapse of forms of the event, doesn't move as seamlessly from the first two as the second did from the first. By the time you're talking about the first one in any serious way, you're already talking about the second. That is, you're saying entangled existence, and you're not all immediately talking about the differential force to affect and be affected by. Then you really, whatever we're talking about doesn't matter when we say existence is entangled. We can just become philosophers and go home. I was a philosopher. I didn't go home. So don't listen to me. Okay. So there's a really smooth, seemingly smooth move, or should be a smooth movement between the first two. That doesn't seem as smooth when you're saying, oh, and the third. But the effects of axiom 1 on 2 and the political imaginary of the event is truly unavoidable. The importance of the event, or its imaginary, to political theory, after all, could hardly be overestimated. As a political theorist, Ian Mackenzie notes, the central task of political theory is, quote, to debate the meaning of political events, and this central task, he argues, is always preceded by a need to provide, quote, an account of political events qua events, quote. Now, the task of mastering the history of recent Western theories of the event, proposed by Rancière, Foucault, Deleuze, Badiou, Lazarato, etc., would be already kind of like enough already. But the environmentalism of the poor, the subaltern of brown and black commons have added new dimensions and modalities to these Western obsessions with the big event, the Big Bang, the catastrophe, politics as a rupture. The rupture of social time and space, felicitous and infelicitous allegiance to an event, the reorganization of the senses, the micro and molecular agencies providing the condition or impediment of the primary of an event form, the primarily discursive versus affective dimensions of the event, the virtual event, the pure event, the divine event, and the intermittent event. Across all of this, the reign of the revolutionary event, class, perhaps even in Fanon's sense, the violent destruction of the colonizer and colonized, has been supplemented, and here I mean supplemented, I'm going to come back, by various forms of the quasi-event, micro-event, slow death, slow violence. These quasi-events, etc., are not merely supplemental, but supplement, but they also displace this big event, the catastrophic event. When we understand that the surfaces of existence and this entangled existence with these differentials of power being able to keep in place or go in and take out of place, always having to be in need of reinforcement. So there's nothing in place that isn't constantly being kept in place. And all of these forms of the event are crucial to understand how the modes by which the distribution of power and the power to affect a given terraining of existence are maintained, navigated, and interrupted. That was the whole point of the environmentalism of the poor, the argument about quasi-events in the black and brown commons, that Western theory's celebration and embrace of the event was a way of never taking ethical, political, or social responsibility for the constant crumbling of other worlds. But this third axiom argues both that the form of the event has multiplied, now we have many kinds of events, and that the event as such has collapsed. Now, this collapse of the event doesn't mean that nothing ever happens or the more things change, the more they remain the same. Rather, in the shadow of the first and second axioms, tangled existence, differential powers, events don't merely shrink. Events are displaced by unevenly distributed and dispersed uneventful happenings across these terrains. In repetition and difference, for instance, Deleuze argued that any encounter creates intensities. And he argues that these intensities may rise to the threshold, to the level of a threshold, what he called the threshold event. A moment when an intensity creates a phase transition, which is what people are worried about the oceans. But most intensities that radiate from an encounter, or I think in the language of the sacking and resacking, everything's entangled, everything's caught up in everything, rather than an encounter, because an encounter is like bang, are so small, low, or slow that no transition ever occurs. But whether these kinds of intensities give rise to a qualitative shift in materiality or not, these pullings that are not encounters, these distributing $60,000 so some people won't be touched when other people are radically beaten back, do something. They might not make an event, small or large, but they do something. They disclose something. And these doings and disclosures are themselves unpredictable and unknowable. So we know some things, but of course we're never going to know everything. Hannah Arendt's understanding of action gives us a hint of the kinds of actions without events at stake here. The consequences of action is boundless because action, though it may proceed from nowhere, so to speak, acts into a medium where every reaction becomes a chain reaction and where every process is the cause of new processes. Perhaps counterintuitively, nothing happens in these forms in which the event collapses in the sense of no phase transition occurring as part of the boundless, unpredictable nature of action. that a region of existence can't seem to dislodge what is sucking it dry. Right? And here, at the moment, we have Black Lives Matter with incredible force trying to re-embank modes of Black lives. And we still have primarily white policemen shooting African Americans in the back with no consequences. Even when a region of existence, in this sense human existence, in all of its material extensions, can't seem to dislodge what is sucking its dry, that no matter what they try to do, nothing seems to be happening. Nevertheless, in keeping an intensity forward, something is maintained and endured. An event doesn't happen, but an endurance does. The need to weigh equally the multiplicity and collapse of the event is crucial if we fully understand the importance of the fourth axiom, namely, what everybody is saying in critical theory, across those people I named, that we are seeing the collapse of Western disciplines of embodied distinction and hierarchy. We don't do life, non-life, we don't do humans, and then forms of humans, and then under them, and under them, and under them. But to understand what's at stake in this collapse, we first have to reverse the numerical ordering of these axioms. That is, what was first, perhaps in logic, the entanglement of existence, is last in determination. What is last in what appears to be simply a semantic hierarchy of thought is first in the hierarchy of direction and inspiration. The fourth axiom insists that all those other ones must be motivated by a critical historical directionality rather than by a disembodied Western epistemological understanding of the ontological nature of existence. Yes, it insists that all beings are indeed the result of a history of becoming with, including disciplinary being. But these becomings with and this extant existence absorbs everything, even as a stubborn insistence to remain, a refusal simply to go holds on. How these encounters, or embaginations, or ridges, or embankments, or the contours of extant existence, or tangled existence, how they're made thingish within the ecstasy of becoming with, can lead to two very different narratives about the powers of some regions of existence to determine thought over other regions of existence, to claim thought in one region of existence rather than the other. Was the emergence of scientific consciousness of symbiogenesis the result of maverick developments in the biological and informational sciences, which resulted in the, quote, final imposition of a grid of control on the planet? Or were this scientific consciousness, and I would say critical consciousness that now tells us that existence is entangled, that the power is fixed, etc., or were these the result of like mavericks in science, mavericks in critical theory? Such big brains we have. Or were these a symptom of the West having lost control of the orders, categories, processes, and consequences of the way in which it initially read existence and governed existence? That is, how these axioms are narrated, how they are made a narrative thing, what stories we tell, leads to a very different orientation, a different direction by which we tell of their coming to exist. And here we return, rather than to Bateson, rather than to Haraway, who's, broad great. Like, this is not throw throw them away. I'm also for keeping as many people on the planet as possible, in a political sense. But we would turn to the history of another region of the seas and the oceans, a history of the Caribbean, and indeed perhaps even the history of an island in the Caribbean, an island called Martinique, where first Césaire in Discourse of Colonialism argued that Europe wasn't a thing that came to the New World, wasn't a thing that displaced indigenous peoples in the New World and did a double displacement of enslaved men and women for Africa into that world, but rather that Europe itself was constituted out of what Arendt and others, and he called the little Hitlers and the racial terror produced in these spaces of colonialization and then circulating back into Europe. It's because Césaire, Glissant, Fanon all insisted, and others like them, that existence could not be separated in terms of white Europe and its diaspora and the colonies, but that existence was a form of unsacking certain spaces, of dispossessing certain people, of uprooting specific relationships that did not depend on the Western hierarchies and distinctions of existence. That we now sit in this room and have 4 axioms. Thank you. The idea was to, the idea was to begin the talk with a different history of the emergence of our new idea that, existence is entangled, so, right? And place it in a very different history. A history that doesn't flow through either the Western natural sciences, no matter how maverick and interesting, it's totally good, or the history of science and technology studies, which I, again, totally love. That's not the issue. But rather to begin in a different direction. And the quote, which is, it's a famous quote. I mean, so much of his work is, and it's about the beginning there is it begins with him and others who think of the Middle Passage as part of the, Christina Sharp, part of the embodiment of the African diaspora. Right? So it's a direction, which I think is really important, set of origins, like the direction, and a very powerful non-metaphor. I mean, he's a poet, but this is not a metaphor, right? Of bodies within other bodies as a condition of other bodies, right? And so then the idea is that we start with, we know about entangled existence and we know the references, but by the time you get to the end, you realize that you come back to the force that started this, and yet is often, is often written out of climate change, and right, it's written in a lot in many places. It's written out in other places, and the West is able to once again talk about the unfolding of its own thought. I would suggest I'll use the I word.
Yes, please, at the back.
Maybe jumping off of that, like, kind of West's ability to unfold its thought, I'm wondering about, I mean, it's more of a prompt than a direct question.
Go ahead.
Kind of these fictitious categories of post, anti-colonization as practices and as genres of thought, and those kind of like the positionalities that those
good. Obviously, always someone stands up and says, "This is part of a longer chapter." I think the way I'm going to come back to the anti, the D, the post-colonial, the post-colonizing, the ongoing dispossession, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't mean that, et cetera, i.e. whatever. I mean that we have a lot of good critical terms to work with. As I move out of this section and go into the next section of this thing, I begin by returning to that second axiom. And I say axiom because I'm trying to say, look, this is not my idea. This is what we all kind of, basically think. So what are we doing if we're just returning and using the same political concepts, same modes, et cetera? So one of the things I say there, it has to do with 1 and 2, is we can't say I, you, this, that, here, there, now, then. We have to say I-ish, you-ish, here-ish, now-ish, this-ish, then-ish. And when I say we have to do that, one of the things we have to do is both say, yes, things are entangled, and so my good body, my good water, is made by the extension of your shitty water, right? That's not outside of me, that's inside of me in a way that I put outside. I think the terms anti, and I'm going to come back to the potable thing, anti, post, etc., are all ways in which we're trying to say there remain ridges and effects of this history of various forms of dispossession. And there are good debates about why we should use one or the other, like anti-colonial versus post. In the best of spirits, I would say that everyone's trying to point to that these things were formed and they are continuing to function. And I use the salt water and fresh water, more fresh water, as an example of how we all say, it is entangled, different power to affect and be affected, collapse of the hierarchies and quasi-events, that when it comes to detoxification, when it comes to what do we do about the fact that depending if you're, of a certain class, if you're a certain kind of skin color, if you're black, if you're a migrant, that your water, that your lands will be either more subject to extraction or pollution. And one of the things that a liberal imaginary, you can hear it, you just listen, it's like, oh, that's wrong, we should not be racist, classist, etc. We should go in there, remove the toxins, replace it with good stuff, whatever that is, and then we can restore it or return it to its original should-be clean thing. And how could you argue with that? Right? Except for the fact that what it's actually doing is saying, don't come and touch our neighborhoods and our pipes. Just, we need to find the money to build your infrastructure. So Flint's still under government regulation, and the only problem is you can't find the money to it. Well, that material is going to be taken from somewhere, and pounds of peanuts being taken from native lands, right? And it's going to be manufactured somewhere. Pounds of peanuts, not going to be in those suburbs, and going to be spewing the toxin somewhere, and then they bring it. So, you know, what if you said to those suburbs who have differentially been embodied and sacked, whatever, through this externalization of their own bad health, said, you know what, we're not going digging in somebody else's land. We're going to come and dig in your neighborhood. Or we're just going to, everybody's going to come in and take your water. Or, you know what, we'll just mix the pipes and you can have some of the brown, dirty, polluted, toxic water. You can do your share of ingestion. Right? As someone once said to me when I said this, they said, that's never going to happen. So what do? Go into the neighborhoods and knock on the door and say, I want your water. But that's what these I really think they're trying to do. And I just want us to go, if we're going to say this, we can't just keep on saying using the same political concepts. Empathy, solidarity with everything. It's like, I don't have solidarity with everything. There's some things I think need to get unsacked because the condition of their sacking really messes up people that, you know, not care about. So, where'd my ginger milk go? Is that where you were getting at a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
yeah.
It feels like this, you know, when you're saying like this fallacy of detoxification,
yeah.
It very much feels like it acknowledges the fact that, you know, matter cannot be created or destroyed. It's simply transversal through, and I mean, like, I think to a certain extent, the historical conditions of these things are also, they are created and they are not destroyed. And there is no...
They're remixed in different ways that we wouldn't know, you know,
yeah.
that's really, and they create some really weird spaces. So, I mean, I've told this before. I'm part of the Cotterbean Film Collective, and it's about 30 of us in all ages, and everyone's indigenous except me. We've known each other a long time. Our worlds evidence this unequal piping of value, right? And do I have time? Okay, we were doing our second film, and it was about these four young guys came up with the idea, and then everybody else layered stuff on there. And until the end of the film was 4 young guys get chased into a contaminated swamp. Indigenous guys get chased into a contaminated swamp. There's a standoff with the police who won't go in there because it's radiated. And you know who's gonna, and meanwhile miners are digging up their land illegally everywhere. And we always say, you know who's gonna go to jail in the end. It's not gonna be the miners, right? But there's a scene in the toxic swamp that we're shooting with 2 of the young guys, and it's all ad-libbed, and we, you know, pulled out of real life and stuff. And so Calvin was one of the young guys. Bigfoot was with Reggie Jerk, and they're holding off. They don't want to go outside because they don't want to go to jail. And the scene is Calvin's got to reassure Reggie that the police won't come in. So, you know, he was like, wait a minute, I got to figure out what to say. So we waited until we figured it out. He said, okay, I'm ready. And so we, you know, we started shooting, and Reggie said, oh, they're the police, you know, and he's worried they're going to come in. And Calvin says, don't worry, we're safe. It's a radiation area. They're not going to come in. It's a radiation area, we're safe, right? And it was an amazing moment. It's an amazing moment in the film. And it, you know, I always use the phrase toxic sovereignty. It's like white people, once they really can create these toxic cesspools, they won't go in. So Kelvin is saying, this is the area in which I have almost pure sovereignty as an indigenous young man. Right? I can do what I want because settlers are not going to come in. But at the same time, like when we're all sitting there, collective sitting there thinking about it, of course, the obvious issue is, but he can't live in it, right? And we see this across so many, like Chernobyl. Oh, Chernobyl's coming back to nature. There was a good journalist who said it is true that there are these herds of mammals coming back, but it may be that radiation is less dangerous to them than humans. So again, it's like as we're celebrating these like variously emerging forms, that we also don't go up into abstraction again. We just stay out there. Yeah.
Kind of along those lines, your last comment here, but we're still here.
Mm.
And we kind of, is that to suggest that endurance and being still here is in itself a sufficient critique or a kind of politics that just by surviving, even if in a toxic swamp, where do you want to go with this idea? How far do you want to go with this idea of if all other forms of articulated politics are moot, just by enduring, by being still here, we've already accomplished something?
Yeah, I should say that that's not the we of anybody. That's the Cotterving saying, the indigenous Cotterving saying. After all of this, we're still here, right? And I put that up not as a, I'll come back, not as well, here's the answer, just stay in place, because they want to go beyond just staying in place. They want to expand their place. They want their place to not be so strained, right? They don't want to, like, they have to constantly be in the kind of activities of embankment that they're in, like constantly worrying, constantly looking, constantly. Like with other people that walk around, we know this from disability studies, right? If the world is formed for you, you don't notice a curb. Right? If you're in a wheelchair, you see every curb because it's not formed for you. So it's a specific. We're still here. It's registering something about the limit to the reach of extractive mining, of the cunning of recognition. So it's saying, it's kind of, earlier I got to one thing today, but it was really super interesting. It says the catastrophe hasn't washed us away, okay? So we're still here. The second reason for this is something that I always say, which is in certain places that endurance isn't seen as a creative or vital force, right? So it's just seen as, well, some people just don't change, or the easiest thing is just to repeat yourself, or some people just like their traditions and never change it. Versus the creativity of ongoing temporal teleological unfolding or whatever. What I think what they've said is there's nothing so creative as trying to keep yourself in place while a certain kind of force is constantly trying to displace you. So yeah, on the one hand, in some places that we are still here, that moment of survivance is indeed the politics. But it's not going to be the politics everywhere. In some places, the go away is the politics. In some places, not existing anymore would be the politics. In those suburbs, maybe not existing like that would be the politics. So if you're really thinking about Untangled this way, that these big rules, it depends where you are in that system. Yeah.
Is that
that's right.
And I was thinking about that as an overarching metaphor for the material transitivity that you want us to think about as a methodological horizon. And I think I'd like to understand materiality in this a little better through the four different things that you said remember them, so I tried to remember. So I can see the material transitivity or the tailings that are the cause and effect kind of relationship between embankment tailing, right? I can see that in the first three. I can see it in the interactivity, in the entanglement. I can see it in the distribution of power, if I'm remembering these things wrong. And I can see it in
event.
Oh, I thought event was three. What's
event, and you can see it in event,
Yes, and an event, and two was the
unequal.
Okay, the power is unevenly but vastly distributed.
Modification only, I would never say cause an event. But whatever.
Yes, that's very interesting. This is, I think, what my question is.
Yeah,
so,
but the fourth.
Then there's fourth.
Yeah, the fourth.
So there's fourth, which is the critical and the historical. The dialectical. In some way, but maybe you also need that word. But I have the question, which is Gregory Bateson.
What?
Bateson. What is Bateson here for? And you said we can keep him in this, so I can keep him in this version.
In the thing that comes before this, he's presented as someone who insacked other forms of existence, and then really, instead of seeing those as the direction that gave him insight, he resacked it into the unfolding of Western knowledge. So it's all, and he's the big differentiator of life and non-life. So sorry, I should have said I'm not just arguing for Bateson.
Well,
there's a complex argument way against Bateson.
Ask about him. I guess another way.
Wait. What about axiom 4 and tailings?
I think Bateson is what I want to connect to the axiom 4.
Okay.
So what's the difference between exocytosis and chromatin? Perhaps is another way of asking this question. So Bateson.
You gotta. I tell you, when you give a keynote, you gotta know all your disciplines. Yes, exactly.
His central insight into how ecology should be thought with matter and life is that, in fact, matter is not what's making the difference, and that's where information comes in.
That's right.
And so, in fact, there's actually a whole. It's not a metaphysics, right? It's a different kind of physics that thinks about how, regardless of the matter involved, information can be conveyed that neither reduces the matter involved and is in fact about relationality, which is glissant, right? I mean, glissant is also in that way thinking of relationality in the same way that, and I have many critiques of Bateson, so don't think I'm saying Bateson is great, but there's this question of information and something that isn't quite, it's not beyond matter in the sense of metaphysical, but it's not capturable by matter in any way. So when we talk about the critical and the historical, do we need to think about not information in the cybernetic sense, of course not, but do we need to think about signification of some kind, something that can't be entirely
Okay, good. That's why I put in James, just for this. So Bateson, absolutely, it's the way we would talk about it, and I apologize to everyone for a second. The way we would talk about it in metapragmatics is that the second order, that is the type, constitutes tokenness. It embags a region into kind of things. So you have to have classification in order to gather together. And that's what Bateson is always also borrowing from Ed Sapir and a lot of the meta-linguistic folks. Yeah, it's his anthropology days. Wait. Right. And Bateson also, absolutely. I mean, it's his terror of rocks. He's terror. I say terror.
But he also develops your language in whales.
Yeah, he loves in whales. No, it's like the biosphere. I'm all for him until we hit that rock. And why? Because that's the division that grounds governance if you're an indigenous person in Australia. Right? And if you can't get past the rock, then we have to think, what the heck is this classification information, second, third ordering? What is that? What is that, for me, what is that doing? I.e., what is it keeping in place in terms of governmental system of governance? I can't avoid that. as much as I love it, I just can't, it's like this, it's like a rock in the pit of my stomach. So, the telescope can be part of mind if a life form is using it, but other than it's just reduced cause and effect. So that's where I have to exit Bateson. What James maybe does in his what the Italians call a philosophy of energetics, I'm not sure how to go that far, but is to see mental concepts themselves as entangled in the material and entangled in the materiality of life. So the ability to produce second order, third order, to take in information and produce a token type relation to it. This is a that. This is, you can go up the nominal scale as far as you want. He argues that that is material all the way down, and I would say it sets out all kinds of tailings, all kinds of bits and pieces of half thoughts, no thoughts, intensities that never quite, it was like something was bothering me. Something's bothering me. So-and-so looks at me this way when I walk in the store, but I don't have, I'm being ground up, literally. So that's why I turned to James, and James was too far back to worry too much about rocks. Probably he would have not liked them either, but so that's my longer explanation of all that. But yeah.
Have time for maybe one more question. Now or never.
Yeah.
Yes.
But she said that so joyfully. Yes.
There's a line from Raphael's Invisible Man that goes, "Until some gang succeeds in putting the world in a straitjacket, its definition is possibility." And so all this talk about sacking and encasement reminded me of that line. I've always thought a lot about that straitjacket. And so I guess, on the one hand, and this has to do, I think, with your second axiom and this sort of differential access to even the power to encase or sack. And some people can't sustain their sacking. And some sacks die prematurely or can't keep themselves discreet, can't hold themselves together, right? So I wonder, on the one hand, that a statement like that it seems quite optimistic. Until some gang succeeds in sacking the world, its definition is possibility. And so I wonder if you have has a gang succeeded in sacking the world?
What's it?
Has a gang, maybe we could call it the West or Europe, has it succeeded in sacking the world? Right? Is that
right?
And if it hasn't succeeded, because I guess I'm trying to look for an outlet of optimism, or to preserve.
What if I just smile? No. No, absolutely. That's a gorgeous quote. And because it puts the sack as a kind of thing, right? The mental life, the ridging, the flowing, all of it gives off. The possibility is inherent to the structure, and in that way, it's like you build it, and you build it from, it crumbles, it interacts in ways that you didn't expect, maybe because you can't purify it so much that you're in this dangerous black box, actually. So that there's potential, there's in that sense possibility everywhere. Honestly, I'm more like, possibility as hopefulness is not so much me. Possibility is stubbornness, absolutely. I'm more of a like, okay, yeah, it's possible, but let's also look, and I listen to my colleagues in Australia. There's great possibility in that swamp. But that's an unfortunate, the only place that indigenous people can have possibility is the way in which capitalism put its part of its sacking somewhere else. That's too hard. Is the whole world nothing but the West's good body and it's shitting outside of itself on others? Getting close, but that's what I like. This was Natasha Bigfoot, who's Kelvin's brother. There's also there's still possibility. I mean, it hasn't sacked us in so thoroughly and in such profound ways that we are unable to have a moment of not yet, and therefore there's I think possibility in there, and that's the Cotabang way is not to be hopeful. I mean, they've lived their lives in settler colonialism generation to generation, and it's just you just see the new law coming in and it's going to change everything, and at this point it's like, oh right, going to change everything. It's war's going to go to sort of cut people, but so not hope that way, but stubbornness as a technique, which I think for some is much better than hope or optimism or something like that, because stubbornness, you just keep doing it whatever. Optimism and hope, when things don't work out, it's really debilitating. So I'm hopeful. I don't know. I'm hopeful in the sense that, wow, there are a lot of people that are still going no, and they're pushing in their different ways, whatever it is. They're shoving and pushing and trying, and till the last of the last of the last, when something new comes out, they're doing it. That seems to me great. If that's too low horizon, I don't know. I think that's our horizon. Who is my body, place, stuff taking from to keep in place? What is it producing in doing that? Okay, right on, let's go drink and eat pizza.